Breaking news, those images coming in from the Gulf of Mexico tonight, a deadly blast.
Beneath the tropical waters of the Gulf of Mexico.
The hunter becomes the hunted, and it's every man for himself.
For most of the last century, the Gulf of Mexico was treated like background scenery. It showed up in hurricane forecasts, spring break commercials, and oil company earnings calls. And then everyone moved on. It was the kind of place people assumed would always stay the same, warm, humid, and largely unchanged. That assumption just collapsed. In 2026, the Gulf is at the center of one of the most aggressive economic and territorial repositioning efforts anywhere on the planet, and almost none of it is being driven by the country most people would expect. Start with the part everyone already half knows about, because it's the loudest and the easiest to misunderstand. Early in 2025, an executive order renamed the American side of the Gulf to the Gulf of America. Mapping apps split down the middle depending on which country you were standing in. Late-night hosts got a week of material out of it, and Mexico's president fired back with a joke about renaming the whole continent. It was treated, understandably, as a culture war sideshow. But strip away the punchlines, and what you're left with is a country using a naming convention as a soft claim over shared water, and a neighboring country that had a choice to make: fight the label, or make the label irrelevant. Mexico picked the second option, and that decision is the actual engine behind everything happening in the Gulf right now. Instead of pouring energy into a symbolic fight it was never going to win outright, Mexico quietly redirected that energy into physical infrastructure, energy production, and industrial policy on a scale that dwarfs the naming dispute in every practical sense. While cable news argued about cartography, cranes were going up in Veracruz, drill ships were repositioning off the coast, and rail lines were being laid across the narrowest stretch of the country. The name change was meant to project dominance. What it actually did was accelerate a Mexican build-out that had been simmering for years and is now impossible to ignore. The most audacious piece of that build-out sits at the bottom of the map, where Mexico narrows to barely more than 100 miles wide. This stretch of land, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, has been eyed by engineers since the 1800s as a natural shortcut between the Pacific and the Atlantic. For most of that time, it stayed a historical footnote because the Panama Canal owned that business outright. That's no longer true. Panama has been running into a problem that sounds almost old-fashioned for a piece of critical global infrastructure. It doesn't have enough fresh water. The canal's locks rely on fresh water to move ships through, and years of drought in Central America forced authorities to slash the number of daily transits dramatically. Ships queued for weeks. Some shipping companies reportedly paid multi-million-dollar premiums just to jump the line. A choke point that the entire world quietly depended on turned into a bottleneck almost overnight. Mexico looked at that crisis and saw an opening a century in the making. Billions of dollars have gone into what's essentially a dry canal. The interoceanic corridor of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, a modernized freight rail line connecting the Pacific port of Salina Cruz to the Gulf port of Coatzacoalcos. Ships dock on one coast. Containers get craned directly onto high-speed freight trains, and hours later, not days, the cargo is loaded onto a different ship on the other coast, ready to continue toward Houston, the East Coast, or Europe. A transit through the Panama Canal itself can take the better part of a day, before you even count the waiting time. The rail crossing over the isthmus is designed to take a fraction of that. Early test runs, including a shipment of vehicles moved across the country in record time, were treated less like a pilot program and more like a proof of concept for an entirely new trade route. This isn't just about shaving hours off a shipping schedule, either. The ports on both ends are being dredged and expanded to handle vessels too large for the Panama Canal's locks to accommodate in the first place, which means Mexico isn't competing with Panama on Panama's terms. It's building something that sidesteps the comparison entirely. And strung along the rail corridor are a series of new industrial zones, sometimes called development poles, aimed squarely at manufacturers who don't just want to ship goods through Mexico, but want to build them there. Semiconductor assembly, automotive parts, textiles. The pitch to global companies isn't use our shortcut, it's relocate your factory here and use the shortcut for free. That single shift, from transit corridor to manufacturing corridor, is what turns this from an infrastructure story into a geopolitical one. None of this has happened quietly, either. The corridor is patrolled by the Mexican Navy, which now oversees both the rail line and the ports on either end, a level of militarized control that tells you exactly how strategically important the government considers this piece of coastline to be. While that project reshapes the southern coastline, something far more extreme is happening far offshore, in water, so deep it barely resembles anything most people picture when they think of the Gulf. Roughly 180 kilometers out, in a region called the Perdido Fold Belt, the seafloor drops to around 2,500 meters, deep enough that you could stack several skyscrapers on top of each other and still not reach the surface. This is the site of the Trion Project, a multi-billion-dollar deep-water development that marks Mexico's first serious move into ultra-deep-water oil extraction, an arena the United States has operated in for years using remotely operated vehicles and specialized platforms Mexico simply never had. For decades, Mexico's state oil company stuck to shallow water close to shore because it was cheaper and technically simpler. That approach worked as long as the easy oil kept flowing. It didn't. Production has been sliding. The state oil company is carrying an enormous debt load, and the calculation shifted from why bother with deep water to we don't have a choice. So Mexico partnered with an Australian energy company to build something genuinely ambitious, a massive floating production platform, essentially a semi-submersible steel structure the size of a stadium, tethered to the seafloor and connected to nearly 20 wells drilled at depths and pressures that push the limits of current offshore technology. A separate floating vessel, storing hundreds of thousands of barrels of crude, will sit nearby to load tankers, since there's no pipeline infrastructure out that far yet. It's a strange bet to be making at a moment when the rest of the world keeps talking about moving away from fossil fuels. But the logic isn't really about ideology. It's about balance sheets. The Gulf still holds some of the highest quality crude left in the Western Hemisphere. And in a world where energy security has become a bigger political priority than emissions targets in the short term, Mexico is wagering that this oil is worth more to its economy over the next few decades than the political cost of ignoring the green transition narrative. It's also, more bluntly, a survival move for a company drowning in debt, an attempt to prove to investors and creditors that Mexico still has cards to play in the energy market. Layer all of that on top of the country's broader manufacturing surge, and the picture gets clearer. Years of supply chain disruptions taught global companies a hard lesson about relying on factories on the other side of the Pacific, and the response has been a rapid migration of manufacturing toward Mexico, which offers geographic proximity to the U.S. market that nowhere in Asia can match. Mexico has already overtaken China as the top trading partner of the United States, and a huge share of that growth is landing directly on the Gulf Coast rather than the border towns most people associate with Mexican manufacturing. New industrial parks near ports like Tuxpan aren't just warehouses. They're self-contained zones with their own power infrastructure, fiber connectivity, and legal support designed to make it as easy as possible for a foreign automaker or electronics company to set up shop and start shipping product almost immediately. Foreign direct investment has hit record levels. Ports like Veracruz have been overhauled to handle tonnage that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. And the country is graduating well over 100,000 engineers a year specifically to staff this expansion. None of this is coming without a cost. And it's a cost that's becoming impossible to hide from satellite imagery. Dredging operations needed to deepen ports and accommodate larger ships are kicking up massive sediment plumes along the coast near Veracruz, clouding water that used to be clear enough to support one of the more significant reef systems in the region, a protected biosphere reserve that's now under direct pressure from the very industrial expansion meant to make the country more competitive. Fine sediment blocks sunlight and settles on coral, and once that damage sets in, recovery isn't measured in months. It's measured in decades, if it happens at all. Further south, industrial runoff and intensified agricultural production tied to the new manufacturing corridor are feeding oxygen-depleted dead zones in the water, the kind of hypoxic conditions usually blamed on nutrient runoff from much larger river systems further north. Fishing communities near Tabasco have reported mass fish kills large enough to be visible from well offshore, a stark and immediate consequence in a region that supplies a huge share of the seafood consumed across North America. The government has responded by expanding protected fishing zones, but conservationists argue it's a fraction of what's needed to offset the scale of industrialization underway. Even the deepwater drilling adds its own quieter form of disruption, since the acoustic surveying and constant vessel traffic associated with a project like Trion interferes with the migration patterns of whales and dolphins that have used these waters for a very long time. Put all of these pieces together, and a genuinely different Gulf starts to come into focus. It's not a shared, sleepy body of water anymore. It's rapidly becoming the operational backbone of a new North American trade relationship, one that runs through Mexican rail lines, Mexican ports, and Mexican deepwater rigs rather than around them. The naming dispute that dominated headlines was never really the point. It was a distraction that happened to coincide with and arguably accelerate a much bigger and more consequential transformation that Mexico had already set in motion. A bid to replace outdated shipping routes, extract oil from waters it once avoided, and position itself as the manufacturing partner the United States can no longer do without. Whether you refer to it as the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of America, the water itself doesn't care what it's called. What's actually changing is who controls the flow of goods and energy moving through it. And increasingly, that answer is Mexico. The country isn't just reacting to pressure from its northern neighbor or from a struggling Panama Canal anymore. It's actively rewriting its own economic future one port, one rig, and one rail line at a time, and the rest of the hemisphere is going to have to adjust to that reality, whether it's ready or not. It's worth stepping back and asking why this particular moment produced this particular response, because the timing isn't a coincidence. Global supply chains spent years running on the assumption that distance didn't really matter as long as shipping stayed cheap and predictable. Once that assumption broke, every country with a coastline and a decent labor pool started looking for a way to capture some of the manufacturing capacity fleeing Asia. Most of them didn't have the geography to pull it off. Mexico did, and more specifically, the Gulf Coast did, sitting directly across a short stretch of open water from the busiest ports in the American South. That's not something a government can manufacture through policy alone. It's an accident of geography that happened to line up perfectly with a shift in how the world wants to move goods, and Mexico has spent the last few years making sure it doesn't waste the opening. There's also a financial pressure underneath all of this that rarely makes it into the headlines. A state oil company carrying more than $100 billion in debt doesn't get to sit out a moment like this. Every dollar spent on the Interoceanic Corridor or the Trion platform is also, in a sense, a pitch to bondholders and international investors who need convincing that Mexico can still generate the kind of revenue that justifies continued lending. Infrastructure spending on this scale is usually framed in terms of trade routes and manufacturing jobs, but a good portion of it is really about creditworthiness, about proving a heavily indebted state enterprise still has a viable future. That's part of why the pace has been so aggressive. Slow, cautious build-outs don't reassure creditors the way a functioning rail corridor and a producing deepwater platform do. None of this guarantees the bet pays off. Deepwater drilling projects routinely run over budget and past deadline. Dry canals depend on rail capacity and border logistics holding up under far more volume than they've ever handled. And the environmental toll along the coast is the kind of thing that tends to generate its own political backlash once the damage becomes undeniable rather than theoretical. Global oil prices could make the Trion investment look brilliant or reckless, depending on where they sit 5 years from now. And the same manufacturing boom pulling factories toward the Gulf Coast could just as easily pull back if energy costs, water shortages, or labor disputes make Mexico less attractive relative to other nearshoring options. What's clear right now in 2026 is that Mexico isn't waiting to find out. It's committing capital, labor, and political capital to the bet regardless of the risk, betting that a narrow window to reshape North American trade won't stay open forever, and that whoever moves first ends up writing the rules everyone else has to follow. That's the real reason the Gulf looks so different than it did even 5 years ago. It was never really about a name on a map. It's about a country deciding it no longer wants to be a passive backdrop to someone else's trade route, and doing whatever it takes, from the ocean floor to the factory floor, to make sure the water surrounding it works for its own future instead of everyone else's. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.